prepared. And that will probably take better part of an hour, believe it or not, and then we'll have an hour for discussion. Is that okay? Okay, good. So the title of my talk today, as you can see on the board, on the screen, is Post-2015. Has the era of sustainable development finally arrived? You'll understand why that question in a moment, hopefully. Sustainable development is an idea that's been with us for some time, a few decades, in fact. But is it an idea whose time has finally come? In today's talk, I intend to walk you through the history of sustainable development, to mark important milestones, but also to flag false dawns and frustrated expectations. And the end point of the journey is the present and the near future, more precisely the next 11 months, when governments, members of the United Nations, will be focused on negotiating a post-2015 development agenda. Some of you might have heard of this, others maybe not, and deciding how far they wish to make that agenda a truly sustainable development agenda, adopting a proposed set of sustainable development goals, or SDGs, as they're called, as its centerpiece. If they do, the answer to the question posed in my title should presumably be a yes, or at least a yes, maybe, rather than a definitely not. Megan has already indicated that I have a certain interest in this topic, having been the leader of the team which supported the negotiations of the future we want, the outcome of Rio Plus 20. Oops, I'm going through my slides too fast here. Giving you a preview. And also having been the head of the team which supported the Open Working Group, some of you might have heard of this, on Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll come to towards the second half of my talk. So, putting sustainable development on the map, first heading. The well-known Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, was issued in 1987, so that's more or less our starting point, though I'll make a reference even to earlier dates like 1972 in a moment. Many of you weren't even born then, I guess, almost, well, no, not all of you, but most of you. And that provides the now familiar and still most common definition of sustainable development. That is, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The report was done for the United Nations, and it was a major inspiration for the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development held in Rio de Janeiro, commonly referred to as the Earth Summit. The 1992 conference marked the arrival of sustainable development on the international stage as a subject of international discussions and negotiations. Before that, it was just a concept. Early wins and false dawns. 2 years after the Brundtland report, the international community ratified an agreement to cooperate to tackle one of the clearest examples of a global environmental problem caused by human economic activities. This was the Montreal Protocol on ozone-depleting substances. More recently, with growing scientific understanding of the human contribution to climate change, some scientists have dubbed our modern era as a geologic age known as the Anthropocene. The Montreal Protocol, arguably, was the first official intergovernmental recognition that human activities are indeed disrupting ecosystems and life support systems on a planetary scale. In short, that humans have become a dominant force shaping the fate of the planet. The Montreal Protocol had a number of design features which contributed to its being one of the most effective multilateral environmental agreements to date. First, it acknowledged that developing countries needed a grace period, set at 10 years, to make the investments and economic adjustments required to phase out their use of ozone-depleting substances. I guess you're familiar with the ozone problem and the ozone layer, so I don't need to give you any background on that. Second, it created a multilateral fund to support those investments in developing countries so that the costs of phase-out were shared with developed countries. Third, it contained trade provisions which prohibited trade not only in ozone-depleting substances like chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, but also in products containing those substances like refrigerators and foam, air conditioners. This last provision was crucial to deter what are called free riders, those who would benefit from others' actions but not bear the costs of action themselves. And so there was basically universal signing up to this agreement. No major producer or user of these substances stayed outside. No free riders. Just this September, a group of scientists issued a report to the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, finding that the Earth's protective ozone layer is well on track to recovery in the next few decades, thanks to concerted international action to phase out ozone-depleting substances. So, an early win. We have an early win here in terms of international legislation to deal with the global environmental problem. This landmark piece of environmental legislation would soon be followed at the 1992 Rio Conference by others aiming to tackle global environmental problems. This included the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, CCC. While providing the legal framework for action on these issues, these two treaties have not fared nearly as well in implementation. For example, the Kyoto Protocol of the UNFCCC, which set quantified emission targets for developed countries for the period 2008 to 2012, was never ratified by the United States. And in the negotiations of its extension beyond 2012, we're now in 2014, Canada withdrew and Russia signaled its intention to do so. So the fact is that the Kyoto Protocol now covers only a fraction of global greenhouse gas emissions and cannot therefore effectively address the problem of climate change. Indeed, in the past decade, global greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise despite a small dip that you can see there around 2009 due to the most severe global economic downturn in the last 3/4 of a century. Similarly, despite the Convention on Biological Diversity, and you can also see what is going on here in terms of where the increase in emissions is coming from. It is largely from China and to a lesser extent from other emerging economies, whose economies are growing very fast, fueled by fossil fuels, of course. Mostly, not all, not entirely. Similarly, despite the Convention on Biological Diversity, there has been no evident decline in the rate of biodiversity loss since 1992. Indeed, some parts of the world, and for some classes of species, the rate of decline appears to have accelerated. If you look at this chart here, you see just about 1992-93, a sharp decline indicating a growing number of threatened bird species in the Indo-Malay region. Also at the Rio Conference in 1992, UN member states adopted two other documents that constitute not hard law like the conventions that I've just mentioned, but soft law. The first is the Rio Declaration and its 27 Rio Principles, which aim to define broad parameters of action to advance sustainable development, like the polluter pays principle, like common but differentiated responsibilities, which I'll come back to shortly, like the precautionary principle. The second is Agenda 21. Some of you might have heard that from Fox News. An ambitious and detailed action plan, Neither of these is legally binding. They are only so good as the political will to honor and implement them. And we'll come back to the question of political will shortly. So with this substantial body of hard and soft legislation to show, Rio 1992, the Earth Summit, seemed to have succeeded impressively in putting sustainable development on the global policy map. Alas, this seems in retrospect to have been a false dawn. What soon became apparent is that the political commitment for pursuing sustainable development that balances the three dimensions, the economic, the social, the environmental, was half-hearted at best. Unidimensional thinking continued, with the prevailing mindset, to paraphrase a US political operative, it's the economy, stupid. So when it comes to implementation, tough choices have to be made in terms of both domestic policy and international policy. And the politics, if not the economics, of these choices have made for a seemingly intractable problem, the essence of which can be described in relation to climate change. The scientific community issues more dire and more certain warnings of the consequences of inaction. Governments see action as costly in the short run, competing with other priorities. They fear the political repercussions. They know the problem isn't going away, so they try to shift the burden. Developing countries point to the historic contribution of developed countries to cumulative greenhouse gas emissions and concentrations in the atmosphere, and argue it is developing countries' turn, indeed their right, to industrialize, whatever the implications may be for those emissions. Developed countries, on the other hand, tend to downplay historic responsibility, some at least do, pointing to the current dominance of developing countries in global emissions and emissions growth, and arguing the need for emerging economies to commit to stronger actions to slow their emissions. So bargaining over country commitments on emissions reductions is caught up with geopolitics, with history, with competitiveness considerations. And meanwhile, a large number of small and poor countries stand to lose, in some cases permanently, in the case of small island developing states, some of them, should global collective action fail. In terms of domestic policy, the emphasis, perhaps unsurprisingly, continues to be on economic growth, whether reviving it after the crisis, sustaining it, in the case of many developing countries who have a hard time sustaining growth, or accelerating it, with only limited attention to the major changes needed in domestic energy, transport, agriculture, and other systems to limit greenhouse gas emissions over the long term. European countries, notably through the European Union, have led in terms of climate policies. For example, just last week, the EU increased its ambition on greenhouse gas reductions, committing to a 40% reduction from 1990 levels by 2030, and even increasing that if strong commitments come out of Paris next year, and I'll come to Paris in a moment. And recently, the United States government has been stepping up, initiating executive action to curb emissions from automobiles and coal-fired power plants. It remains to be seen how far these actions will galvanize the international negotiations to conclude a global climate deal due to be sealed in Paris towards the end of next year. Whereas the Kyoto Protocol only specified quantified commitments for developed countries, the new treaty or agreement is intended to define measurable and verifiable commitments for all countries, while recognizing common but differentiated responsibilities, as in Principle 7 of the Rio Principles. Also critical to progress on the road to Paris next year will be the demonstration by developed countries of good faith efforts to deliver on the commitment which they made at the Copenhagen conference in 2009 to provide $100 billion a year by 2020 in financial support to developing countries for climate change mitigation and adaptation. The snail-like pace of progress on climate change is only the most obvious example of weak political will to make the hard decisions needed to achieve sustainable development. At the same time, it's by far the most troubling, given the fact that the window is fast closing on the chance to stay within the 2 degrees C mean temperature rise above pre-industrial levels over this century. Another example of this weak political will has been the dysfunctionality and ineffectiveness of international institutions created to oversee international governance for sustainable development. These include the UN Environment Program I mentioned earlier, created in 1972, and the UN Commission on Sustainable Development, created after the Rio conference in 1992. UNEP's star shone brightly in the years before and during the Rio 92 conference, when it guided the negotiations of the several multilateral environmental agreements that I just mentioned. But by the late 1990s, its star had begun to wane, eclipsed to some extent by the rising star of the CSD, the Commission on Sustainable Development. UNEP came to be seen as a weak international body, for example, by comparison to the ILO, which can negotiate and initiate negotiation of conventions. That period leading to Rio was an exceptional period for UNEP, when it did indeed initiate negotiation of conventions, but it really hasn't done much of that since. UNEP has limited power to shape international and national policy. Unlike the UN Development Program, it doesn't have any national offices spread around the world, so it's not really able to understand problems on the ground that countries are facing very well. One view is that this weakness was by design, that when UNEP was created in 1972, it was given limited resources and powers. With limited membership, it wasn't a universal membership body, without any autonomous governance structure. It was simply one among other UN programs and agencies, reliant increasingly on voluntary contributions from generous donor governments. The Commission on Sustainable Development started out with high expectations right after the Rio conference. It was meant to be the place where governments and other actors, stakeholders in UN jargon, could come together to discuss sustainable development in its 3 dimensions in an integrated way. It was meant to be the place to consider how best to resolve trade-offs and exploit synergies across these dimensions, the environment and economy, the social and environmental. It was the body responsible for monitoring implementation of the commitments made at Rio. Its star rose for a number of years, but after the Rio +10 summit that was held in Johannesburg in 2002, that star too began to wane. In recognition of the preoccupation of countries with reversing the adverse social impacts of the structural adjustments they had to make to their economies after these crises I just mentioned, strong emphasis was put in the Johannesburg summit on poverty eradication and social development, on the MDG agenda. The MDGs were to become the dominant theme of development cooperation for the next decade. In those goals, environmental sustainability was covered in a single, standalone goal, MDG 7, which was mostly ignored apart from providing safe drinking water and sanitation, which is really more of a social goal. So consequently, the social indicators began to show accelerated improvement. Rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality, incidence of malaria, TB, and AIDS, all trended downwards, thanks in part to the focused efforts around the MDGs. I was just with Jeff Sachs yesterday, and he's very much convinced. Jeff is, of course, one of the biggest advocates of the MDGs, And he's very much convinced that it was things like the Global Fund to fight malaria, AIDS, and tuberculosis, and Gavi, the Alliance on Vaccinations, which has really made for substantial progress in poor countries on the MDGs, on these social goals. Primary school enrollment, including for girls, trended upward. Meanwhile, measures of environmental health and well-being have continued to show marked deterioration. Next section, paying the piper. But increasingly governments, beginning in East and Southeast Asia, began to recognize that they can no longer put off paying the piper. You know the Pied Piper story. Their children's future is increasingly at stake. In Asia, a change in thinking and priorities began in the so-called tiger economies, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, who had enjoyed decades of rapid economic growth and were now facing large environmental costs of neglect. Indeed, in the first two countries I mentioned, local environmental problems had grown so severe that citizens' movements emerged to form the nucleus of democratization campaigns. In time, as these bottom-up pressures became more widespread, national governments had to respond with stronger environmental legislation and enforcement. Other Southeast Asian economies, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, confronted similar growth-induced stresses and undertook a similar reprioritization. But the game changer has been the emergence of China, which has followed in the others' footsteps, but with a much larger footprint. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the ecological footprint measure of the impact of countries on resources, on the ability of the planet to support human activities. But by that measure, in 2007, China accounted for 41% of Asia's total ecological footprint. Almost half of the total footprint, one country. So from the early 1980s, China relentlessly pursued economic growth. And for the next 30 years, it's quite extraordinary, its economy was doubling in size roughly every 6 years. In time, its citizens were choking on their success, literally. With the emergence of a large urban middle class, the worsening degradation of the environment and attendant health impacts have become less tolerable. A background study for the new Climate Economy Report released at the Secretary General's Climate Summit last month estimates that the health costs of air pollution in China today total more than 10% of GDP. Just lost to the health costs, the productivity losses due to the severe air pollution in China's cities. In India, the figure is more than 6%. Thus, China has had to face up to and begin to address the negative feedback loop from economic growth to local environmental degradation to poor health and reduction in social and economic well-being for its urban population. What is interesting about this for global policy is that China, for reasons of domestic political economy, because the urban middle class is an important constituency, has been increasingly receptive to entertaining measures to control its greenhouse gas emissions, recognizing that policies to reduce coal burning would have co-benefits for climate and local air quality. It would kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, to use an unfortunate metaphor. This growing recognition of the co-benefits of climate action has come even as international pressures have intensified on China, and also on the United States, mind you, to take more forceful climate action. So, to summarize, up until now, by the late 2000s, recognition was growing that unregulated economic growth comes at a high cost, both in immediate health and other negative impacts on the local economy and in worsening climate change. At the same time, and very importantly, it was increasingly recognized that actions to address local environmental degradation like air pollution could yield important climate co-benefits and vice versa. Climate action could yield local health and other benefits. Okay, next section. Decade ends with a bang, the decade of the 2000s, followed by a green dawn, question mark. The beginning of the new millennium saw the bursting of the tech or dot-com bubble, causing a sharp but short-lived slowdown in US economic growth. The recovery was quick, and by mid-decade, the US economy was growing at close to 4% per annum. Meanwhile, China was chugging along, as you know, and so were other countries like India. We now know how that story ended, with the housing market and financial crises that began in the second half of the decade and ricocheted around the world. But noteworthy about the response to these crises was that in global discussions, and there was a lot of global discussion going on the need for a fiscal stimulus to offset the collapse of private demand, the environment was no longer set aside in the get to it when we can box. Rather, in no small measure, thanks to UNEP's and other parts of the UN's call for a green stimulus, major governments around the world decided to direct a portion of their stimulus funds to so-called green infrastructure and other investments like low emissions public transport and subsidies for renewable energy. These were not uncontroversial, mind you, but they were indeed part of the package. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, or HSBC, even reported on the share of stimulus packages devoted to such green investments. Even allowing for some liberality in the definition of green, the sums were considerable, with the US green stimulus estimated at $112 billion, and China's at almost double that amount. In effect, governments were seizing the opportunity to plow public funds into socially beneficial long-term investments. The benefits would be long-term or medium-term that would, under normal market conditions, not have been made by the private sector. The big question then and now, once market and fiscal conditions return to something closer to normal, would such green investments still thrive? And the answer to that depends very much on whether governments are willing to change the policy landscape decisively in ways that incentivize sustained private investment in green energy, transport, buildings, appliances, and other goods and services. And that, I would argue, in turn depends fundamentally on whether governments have changed appreciably their perception of the economy-environment nexus from one primarily involving trade-offs, economic growth or the environment, to one primarily involving synergies, economic growth and the environment, co-benefits. Next section, coming to the present, the need for renewed political commitment. Brings me to the Rio +20 conference. At the turn of the decade, UN member states decided to convene another international conference. Oh no, not another international conference, right? In 2012, 20 years after the Earth Summit, with the express objective of renewing political commitment for sustainable development. And we've already seen, hopefully I've persuaded you, that that commitment waned in the years following the Rio 1992 Earth Summit. Symptomatic of this waning was the emerging governance crisis I alluded to of international institutions for sustainable development, notably the CSD and UNEP, and various multilateral environmental agreements. The gridlock in the climate change negotiations with the very, very slow progress, as I mentioned. So one of the themes of the conference, the Rio +20 conference, was to be strengthening the institutional framework for sustainable development. Read, governance. Further, in the hope of advancing a shared understanding of the potential synergies between economy and environment, the second theme was to be green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. So we had one objective, renewing political commitment for sustainable development, and these two themes. So preparations commenced, and they soon bogged down. On the second theme in particular, green economy. While some countries, notably in Asia, as I mentioned earlier, in East and Southeast Asia particularly, were receptive to discussing a new economic model based on positive mutual reinforcement between economy and environment, many countries hesitated to embrace such an unfamiliar concept as green economy. Some felt it largely left out the social agenda. It was too much focused on the environment and the economy. Others argued that it could result in new and onerous trade and aid conditionalities on developing countries. Products have to be green. Investments have to be green, otherwise you don't get aid, otherwise our markets aren't open, that sort of thing. In the end, the green economy section of the negotiating text of the outcome document for this conference had come to be so hemmed in by qualifiers and reservations as to represent more a warning label than an endorsement of this new product. So the omens for a successful conference were not looking particularly auspicious. Then something largely unexpected happened. What I call the solo surprise. At a preparatory meeting in July of 2011 in the city of Solo, home to Indonesia's new president, a proposal of the government of Colombia, supported by Guatemala and the United Arab Emirates, gained some political traction. The proposal was to mark the occasion of the Rio+20 conference in 2012 by agreeing to develop a set of sustainable development goals, or SDGs, that would take over from and build upon the MDGs going forward from 2015, when the MDGs are supposed to have been achieved. Those goals, if eventually adopted by UN member states, would represent the clearest expression of a renewed political commitment for sustainable development. So they would have achieved the objective of the conference, this renewed political commitment. Concretized it. In due course, the proposal for the development of these SDGs would be incorporated in the negotiating draft and would eventually make its way into the Rio+20 outcome document, the document I held up earlier. The future we want. As the document states, these goals should be, quote, action-oriented, concise, and easy to communicate, limited in number, aspirational, global in nature, and universally applicable to all countries, while taking into account different national realities, capacities, and levels of development, and respecting national policies and priorities, end quote. It goes on to say that that the goals should address and incorporate in a balanced way all three dimensions of sustainable development and their interlinkages, the economic, the social, the environmental. So we come to the open working group on sustainable development goals. This began what has proven to be an historic process wherein UN member states have worked together for 1.5 years to craft a proposal for global goals that would be applicable to all countries. A few noteworthy points before we come to the proposal itself. The inclusion of these SDGs in the Rio+20 outcome was by no means a foregone conclusion, once proposed by Colombia. There was strong skepticism expressed in some quarters, including among developing countries who feared that the broadening of focus of the goals would diminish the emphasis on poverty eradication and the basic social development agenda found in the MDGs. Many countries wanted to carry on and just maybe embellish a bit on the MDGs, not have a completely new and broader set of goals. Second point, the notion of universality, I mentioned that in my quote from the Rio +20 outcome, has been received with some ambivalence by developed countries who are not accustomed to having to answer to international bodies like the United Nations on domestic matters, such as reducing poverty and inequality, or changing unsustainable consumption and production patterns. Third point, developing countries have insisted that an ambitious agenda with an ambitious set of goals must be supported not just by strong domestic policies and institutions, but by enhanced international cooperation, or in UN jargon, global partnership and means of implementation. That refers to financing, science and technology, trade, and capacity building. So the Open Working Group began its work in early 2013. Almost a full year was devoted to stock-taking, working through all of the themes in the Rio +20 outcome document and reflecting on the priorities in each area and how they might be translated into goals and targets. The group benefited from international expertise from all corners of the globe, some of the best minds and practitioners, and from both within and outside the UN system. It also benefited tremendously from the active engagement of civil society organizations and representatives of the so-called major groups in the UN, including children and youth, women and business and industry, among others. And perhaps some of you here today, I think some of you were indeed involved, maybe participated in one or more of those Open Working Group sessions. Earlier this year, the group began deliberating on its draft proposal for the goals and associated targets. Finally, after long days and nights of intensive negotiations, the OWG agreed by acclamation on 19th July to forward its proposal, which contained 17 goals and a very sizable number of targets, to the General Assembly for consideration and appropriate action. So I put up here the 17 goals. We'll return in a moment to the question of the number of goals, which may strike some as generous, considering that there were only 8 MDGs, and recalling the earlier phrase I quoted, limited in number. What does limited mean? Less than infinity, of course, is still a limited number, but 17, okay. Everyone in the Open Working Group agreed that the first order of business in the new set of goals was to finish the work of the MDGs, starting with the eradication of extreme poverty, ending hunger and preventable child deaths, substantially reducing maternal mortality, and providing a quality education to all children and young people with equal opportunities for boys and girls. These were all some of the priorities that build upon the MDGs, and they basically refer to the first 5 of the goals. If you include the water and sanitation, really the first 6 are building upon the MDGs explicitly. The proposed new goals advance the social agenda in some important respects. There is a goal, for example, on reducing inequalities within and among countries. And there are also targets under the poverty eradication goal, Goal 1, on reducing national poverty rates in all countries. Not just ending extreme poverty, but reducing national poverty rates and extending social protection measures, including floors, to reach the most vulnerable. So this would apply equally to Bangladesh, the United States, Japan, in terms of relative poverty or national poverty, social protection. The view in the group was that to put these social development objectives on a firm foundation, it is important to give due regard to building strong, resilient, and dynamic economies. Thus, goals on sustainable energy for all, Goal 7, on growth and employment, 8, and on industrialization, infrastructure, and innovation, 9, also find their way into this new proposal. Economies that have their own growth momentum and are creating decent jobs for all seeking work are most likely to help people to get out and to stay out of poverty. You know, getting out of poverty is one thing. Staying out takes a strong, dynamic economy. A further insight of the group was that in an interdependent world economy, on a planet with limited resources and with fragile ecosystems threatened by the sheer scale of human activities of going on 9 billion people by mid-century, actions will be required in all countries. And in the first instance in developed countries, who are the richest and have the most demands for resources, to ensure that humanity remains within a safe operating space, as some scientists have called it. That is, that human activities do not cause dangerous interference with critical ecosystem functions and life support systems. Scientists have already warned that we are treading dangerously close to, if not already trespassing, certain of these ecological limits, or as they've been called, planetary boundaries. If you have seen the article, it's become kind of an iconic article in Nature. I don't have the date, actually. I've omitted the date of the Nature article by Rockstrom et al., which refers to planetary boundaries being exceeded in the areas of the nitrogen cycle, for example, loadings of nitrogen on the natural environment from fertilizers and so on, biodiversity loss, and climate change. Thus, the proposal of the Open Working Group contains goals that speak directly to reducing these risks, including one on promoting sustainable consumption and production patterns, Goal 12, and others on tackling climate change, which is Goal 13, and protecting and sustainably managing and using oceans, seas, and marine resources, as well as terrestrial ecosystems, forests and land. Not only as a standalone goal, Goal 17, but as cross-cutting in all of the other goals, so that in each goal area there are targets that relate to these means of implementation. So one can think of this architecture, this set of MOI targets, as a kind of a grounding wire, you know, to ground yourself when in an electric storm, connecting the high-flying, ambitious goals to the solid ground of economic reality. After all, nothing comes free. Progress will require dedication of financial, technical, and human resources to a portfolio of activities and investments for sustainable energy, clean water provision and sanitation, quality education, universal health coverage, agricultural productivity enhancement, and the list goes on. Naturally, governments will need to prioritize and allocate resources accordingly. And if governments succeed in achieving Goal 8, one would expect that with strong economic growth, they would generate significant resources of their own through taxes on rising incomes to finance some of the public investments that will be needed towards a variety of the goals. But even so, it is still understandable that developing countries might be concerned that that won't be enough, that there will still be a need for the generation of additional resource flows, investment inflows, both public and private, to be able to progress satisfactorily towards these ambitious goals, especially in some of the least developed countries. Hence the focus in Goal 17 on a revitalized global partnership amongst nation states. But governments alone cannot possibly deliver such a broad agenda, so it will be critical to build multi-stakeholder partnerships that engage a broad range of actors, including private sector, philanthropic foundations, and so on. The pursuit of the MDGs spawned a number of successful partnerships, some of which I alluded to earlier, the Global Fund, the Gavi, and so on. Other partnerships focused around MDG goals are Every Woman, Every Child, to do with infant child mortality, maternal mortality. Zero Hunger Challenge of the Secretary General, addressed to eradicating hunger, and sustainable energy for all, to provide clean energy to poor people and sustainable energy for all people. Many of the goals and targets in the SDG proposal could well succeed in galvanizing action through similar focused partnerships. For example, to end violence in all its forms against women and children. Some of you are working on child soldiers, a partnership around ending child soldiers. To halt epidemics of tropical diseases. That is one of the targets in the SDGs. To make cities healthy, safe, and sustainable places to live. And to promote sustainable consumption and production patterns. Those are just a few possible areas for partnerships. Still, in some cases, it's hard to escape the conclusion that governments will need to step up and play a leading role, whether individually or collectively. For instance, to reduce inequalities within countries, public investments in education will continue to be critical, as will progressive taxation combined with social protection measures. Generous official development assistance, aid as it's called, will continue to be needed to help narrow the wide inequalities between countries. And governments will need to coordinate their actions globally to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. National and local governments, as major providers of infrastructure and agents of urban and other land use planning, will also need to consider how, over the coming decade and a half, the period of the Sustainable Development Goals, climate change will change their job descriptions. What will be needed to make infrastructure climate resilient, to make cities and their populations less vulnerable to extreme weather events, to build their resilience. For even if the international community should manage to strike an ambitious climate change deal in December next year, significant further warming and associated climate change are already inevitable. So like it or not, adaptation to changing climate will have to figure prominently in strategies and plans to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We have to factor that in. And if the Paris Accord disappoints next year, there isn't a strong agreement reached, then the impacts of climate change could become so severe in parts of the world as to render attainment of important goals like ending extreme poverty and hunger highly unlikely. Okay, now, monitoring progress. I have about 5 minutes to conclude, and I have about 3 pages left. I think I can make it. Okay. The idea behind, so the next section is on monitoring progress and ensuring accountability. The idea behind quantified targets is that progress towards our goals can and should be measured. This is essential for effective management in any area, in the private sector, in government, wherever. Countries can, if necessary, devote additional resources to specific priorities which are lagging, change policies, or otherwise act to accelerate progress. As the SDGs are universal goals, such progress ought to be measured in all countries, and all countries could be expected to report periodically to the international community on how they're doing. This is important because of the interdependencies amongst countries we've already talked about, such that country A's progress in limiting its greenhouse gas emissions will have a bearing on the welfare of many other countries. The same is true for global action, for actions in individual countries on things like fish stocks and fishing policies, where what individual countries do will affect the global fish stocks and will impact on other countries. Likewise, actions taken in individual countries on, for example, renewable energy can have important global implications. For instance, Germany and other Europeans' strong policies to scale up renewable energy and China's strong supply response to that demand has had a tremendous impact on driving down the costs of renewable energy for all countries in the world to make it far more affordable. Already there are several international agreements in place, like the multilateral environmental agreements, climate change, biodiversity, and so on, with their own reporting requirements. So in devising any monitoring and reporting for the SDGs, it'll be useful to build upon those mechanisms so as to limit any additional reporting burdens. Still, it will be important to be able to bring all of these relevant indicators, all of this relevant data together to measure progress at the global level, and to see how progress on one goal may either be impeding, or failure to progress on one goal may be impeding progress on other goals. For example, failure to reduce inequalities within a country may have implications for things like health, nutrition, employment, and even social peace and cohesion. And on things like climate change, global fish stocks, what matters is the sum of all individual countries' actions. That's what we really want to know, is whether they add up to the level of effort needed at the global level. So, paving the way to the future we want, post-2015. The Rio +20 outcome not only called for the development of a proposal on Sustainable Development Goals, it also called for their integration into this post-2015 development agenda, which is the agenda that will be adopted by heads of state and government at the UN General Assembly in September of next year. It's expected to be, as Jeff Sachs put it yesterday, the largest gathering, development gathering of heads of state and government in history. We shall see. But it's to be expected that all of your presidents, prime ministers, will be there to sign on to this agenda in September next year. That agenda will be more than the SDGs. Other elements will have to include a financing strategy to mobilize the resources I've mentioned that will be needed for attaining these goals, enhanced technology cooperation, including to facilitate the access to low-carbon energy, climate-resilient agriculture, zero-emissions vehicles and public transport systems, and so on. And a framework for monitoring, and of course, essential vaccines and medicines as well, as we know all too well today. And a framework for monitoring and accountability of all actors, governments, private sector, and civil society, hopefully with the flexibility to revisit some of the targets that are set next year in light of evolving science. We may find out that we're not being sufficiently ambitious because science tells us, no, actually you have to do more if we're going to stay within these, this safe operating space. On financing, an intergovernmental expert committee, which was mandated by the Rio +20 outcome, has met over the last year and issued its report in August. And that is to be followed up with a major international financing conference in July next year in Addis Ababa. On technology, a series of workshops and dialogues has culminated in the report of the President of the 68th session of the General Assembly, with recommendations that now need to be taken forward and put into this agenda. On monitoring and accountability, the newly created after Rio +20 high-level political forum on sustainable development is meant to review progress on the SDGs and the post-2015 agenda, bringing together the goal-specific progress reports made to other bodies and progress reports at the regional level. Also, the Secretary General recently appointed a high-level panel to provide expert advice on how to improve data capabilities, including through big data, use of cell phone and geospatial and other sources of data to enrich official statistics in order to measure progress on the post-2015 development agenda. I don't know if any of you are data wonks, but that report has just been put out for comment on Monday, I think it's 2 days ago. Or actually, 2 days ago was the deadline for providing comments, I think, so you may be too late. All these pieces must now come together in a coherent package that member states are prepared to adopt and own. First, the Secretary General will issue a report in a month or two that seeks to synthesize these various contributions, all of these different reports, processes. And then, beginning early next year, member states must glean from the Secretary General's report, and if need be from these various background reports and processes, the key elements they wish to see in the post-2015 development agenda. They'll not always agree, for sure. And so negotiations are expected to carry on until the end of July of next year. Developing countries have already indicated that they are largely satisfied with the Open Working Group proposal for Sustainable Development Goals and would not like to see it reopened for further negotiation. Certainly not detailed negotiation. Considering how long it took to get to this point, that might prove a kiss of death. It is not clear if all countries share such a laissez-faire attitude. Some have said that they would like to hone the list of 17 goals down to perhaps 10, pointing nostalgically to the 8 MDGs, seeing virtue in simplicity for setting priorities for development cooperation, as well as for didactic and mobilization purposes. Jeff Sachs made this point forcefully yesterday. He'd like to see 10 goals. Yet all recognize that honing that set substantially risks scuttling what was a delicately reached compromise, with no guarantee that individual countries or groups' favored goals would survive. How to do it in a way that you don't end up unraveling it all and everyone is unhappy. So, my final few comments. Will 2015 mark the dawn of a new era of sustainable development? We've reached an important moment in international diplomacy for sustainable development. It's a time of tremendous opportunity, as I hope I've convinced you, with the real prospect that in September of next year, the international community will launch a transformative post-2015 development agenda centered on the SDGs. I mean, if you just look at this set of goals, you think about it, it is pretty transformative if countries took this seriously. With a robust global partnership and means of implementation, broad ownership of governments as well as other stakeholders, and a credible and universal forum for monitoring progress on the goals and targets. At the same time, it is a moment fraught with risks that could derail the negotiating train before it reaches its destination. One risk is that governments will fail to narrow their differences in the climate change negotiations, making an agreement in Paris very unlikely, a strong agreement. This could well poison the atmosphere for the post-2015 negotiations. Alternatively, a breakthrough on the climate change front would provide a strong impetus to the post-2015 negotiations. A second risk relates to the Addis Financing Conference and how far the post-2015 development agenda negotiations can proceed before the main expected deliverables from Addis are more clearly defined. And that conference isn't going to happen until July of next year. Of course, the negotiations will begin much earlier, and so we may have some sense, but still, there's a time and consistency problem here. These multiple process interdependencies render governments' negotiating strategies complex. Some of you may be government negotiators or plan to go back to being government negotiators. And refined negotiating skills will be at a premium. The role of the co-facilitators of this post-2015 negotiation will be critical. The ambassadors, permanent representatives of Kenya and Ireland, have been appointed by the President of the General Assembly to facilitate this process. As with the Open Working Group and its two co-chairs, also the Kenyan ambassador, Macharia Kamau, and the ambassador of Hungary, much will depend on how much trust member states have in these individuals and how much authority they are willing to delegate to them to guide the process. So this is a critical factor. It was certainly critical in the case of the Open Working Group, where the member states placed huge trust in the leadership of these two individuals, these two ambassadors I just mentioned, to guide the process through to a successful conclusion. It will be equally critical that trust be there, and they help guide governments to an agreement in September of next year. So to conclude, there are encouraging signs that we may be in the pre-dawn hours of a new era, a new dawn of sustainable development. Yes, there have been false dawns, as I've pointed out, but governments seem to appreciate, now more than ever before, how much rides on their leadership and their willingness to chart a new course. Thank you very much.